You all ready? Okay.
Good evening. Welcome to the Hungry Mind reading series. Thanks for coming out tonight. As you may have noticed, we're being filmed for for C-SPAN. My joke all day and it backfired. For more information about upcoming readings, our store newsletter is up by the front counter. And to introduce tonight's authors, Mary Vogel.
Thank you. I've been asked to introduce both the book and the authors, so I will do both. We live in a time of change and uncertainty, a time where work is an issue. Institutional upheavals in both the private sector and the public sector have made having a secure job for many not an option. As our society ages, the nature and timing of retirement has become a much more important issue. We worry about our young people. We wonder if they will be able to find meaningful work. Women who have been trailblazers in fields that were inaccessible to them a generation ago are questioning the culture and the values of those fields. Debates about welfare reform raise issues about the need for income and the non-economic rewards for work. This discussion about work is taking place at a time when government is seen as either problematic or ineffectual, where citizens feel a sense of loss of community and a great sense of powerlessness. In Building America, the democratic process of public work, Carey and Boyd cite the rich American traditions of meaningful work to build commonwealth as precedents for civic actions that link work and citizenship together in public work. This book is timely, important, and accessible. Its vision creates the potential for work that builds communities, enriches our lives, and renews our society. It's fitting that this book be presented at the Hungry Mind bookstore, a private, locally owned business that promotes the work of local and national authors by bringing people together to hear them. The Hungry Mind is a community gathering place, a public space for public work. Now about the authors. Harry Boyd is co-director of the Center for Democracy and Citizenship at the Hubert Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. He is also the coordinator of the New Citizenship Project. He has authored a number of books on community organization and citizenship. Nancy Carey is an associate professor at the College of St. Catherine's here in St. Paul. She has been a leader in making higher education and professionalism more accessible and more democratic. After both Harry and Nancy make their presentations, we would like you all to participate by asking questions and participating in a discussion. So.
Thank you very much, Mary. Harry and I are very happy to be here and pleased to talk to you about our book. We'll do a little bit of reading, but we're not going to talk the whole time. We'd really like to engage the audience, all of you, in some lively discussion about these ideas. But I'm going to start by reading the definition of public work. American citizenship in its most expansive sense is understood as public work, visible effort on common tasks of importance to the community or the nation, involving many different people. This older view of citizenship is grounded in people's everyday workplaces and living environments. Public work is always subject to argument and interpretation. Public work makes things, it builds things, it creates social as well as material culture. Public work is work for the public. It is also work of the public and by the public. It brings to the fore questions of responsibility, reciprocity, civic dignity, and accountability. The problem is that this understanding of citizenship has largely disappeared today. Our book is about the large ideas of our time, work and democracy. We argue in our book that while Americans may be angry about politics and politicians, we are not uncaring or apathetic at all about public affairs. And in fact, there's a rich array of civic work that's happening throughout the country in many different settings. But the ways in which intellectuals and image makers and pundits and politicians describe citizenship is far too shallow and too narrow to capture the depth of the work that people in this country are involved in. We use words today like volunteerism or helping out or social capital. There are a lot of words that we use to describe citizenship today that really don't capture the depth of the work. Building America tries to do that. In this book, we recalled older definitions of citizenship, citizenship linked to people's everyday work. Work has been always a source of pride and dignity for us, and most Americans today grow up wanting to do something, wanting to make a contribution, wanting to leave a mark in the public world. And also, the opportunity for public work in our country has been the genius of our democracy. So as we have lost our public culture, as it's shrinking, and as we are losing the practices of public work and the places in which that happens, and as our work, our jobs that we go to every day are losing their larger public meaning, our attitude as a nation is shifting. And we see ourselves less capable of being able to deal with we're not as confident as we once were in order to deal with the problems that are really challenging us today. When the crowd outside Constitution Hall in 1789 asked Benjamin Franklin as he came out the door, what kind of constitution have the delegates created for us? He replied, it's a republic if you can keep it. And that really is the central task for today. This is a book that is hopeful. We think that there are we have gathered many insights with people that we've worked with over the years. And people are working very hard on these ideas of public work in a variety of settings, from government agencies to K-12 schools, from colleges to nursing homes, from hospitals to youth development programs. We think that there is a way to link everyday work to the larger questions of our time. And that's what our book is about. Harry and I wanted to say a few words about how it is we came to write this book. We have been colleagues for 9 years, along with a network of partners, and we've been talking to each other for 19 years. So we've had lots of time to talk about these ideas and watch them grow and develop. We have in common a fundamental belief that people can develop confidence to act on matters that are important to them. But we can't come at this idea in different ways. When I graduated from college a few years ago, I graduated as an occupational therapist. Occupational therapy is a health profession which has some of its roots in Jane Addams' Hull House. The philosophic base of that profession believes that work has transformative qualities. And in the years that I practiced as a therapist, I saw with my own eyes, and with great interest and curiosity as well, people make extraordinary I saw people rise to the occasion. I saw people who were confronted with trauma and disabling conditions redefine themselves. And almost always, serious, meaningful work was at the center of that transformation. as I grew in my professional career, I wondered how that might transfer to larger cultures. And I've been lucky because in the past 10 years or so, I've had a chance to work in two organizational cultures, one a nursing home and the other a college. And to really test out the ideas of how you can begin to think differently about your work, and in that way also address larger questions of our day. Harry's background is a little different. I'll let him tell you about that.
In the 1950s, I wanted to be a spaceman, and look where I am today. In 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist, wrote a book called The Affluent of Society. Some of you may have seen. Galbraith, in that book, warned that America's public world was in danger. He argued that America was increasingly overwhelmed by kind of consumer advertising, which preached to people, convinced people that the private world was the world of freedom, and the public world was the world of coercion and nastiness, and look how far we've come. He also argued that a decent society couldn't exist without a rich public world, libraries and parks and public buildings and care for people across income and racial lines and cultural lines, without schools that were community centers, without good roads and mass transportation, without things of public beauty. He sketched in that affluent society a vision of a public world. Now, in 1958, when I wanted to be a spaceman, I wouldn't have called it a public ambition, but in fact, one of the sides of America has always been an adventurous public spirit, a willingness to reach out and engage different kinds of people and welcome people of different backgrounds and histories, to engage in great public tasks. And of course, that was the beginning of the whole space program, which I was entranced by. But not long after, that was growing up in the South, in Georgia. My family got involved in the civil rights movement, first in keeping public schools open, actually, in Georgia, and then in desegregation efforts in different ways. And my teenage years were really shaped in the 60s by the civil rights movement. And the striking thing that changed my life in the civil rights movement was that I saw people who felt radically excluded from the public world, African Americans in the South who were legally barred from many public environments, or second-class citizens, claim a public world, and in the process change the understanding of who they were and change the world. As the song about Rosa Parks put it, as when Mama Parks sat down on the bus in Montgomery, the whole world stood up. And again I would see young kids who hated school or who felt alienated and who got involved in demonstrations or practical projects in communities as part of the civil rights movement, or in what we called citizenship schools or freedom schools, come alive with a new sense of who they could be. And it was the power of discovery of a larger public world, that people felt they could make a difference, they could be first-class citizens, that had such transformative power. And I think our work has been driven for many years by anger at the decay and the derision about public things, and the sense that a great American calling that kind of counterbalances our radical get-rich-quick individualism, a great American tradition has been the building of public things, the creation of public things, the care for public things, from voluntary fire departments to community projects around libraries and schools and parks, to people feeling they built the country, and the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, when 3 million young people built national forests and parklands and monuments that are still with us. Oh, you want me to? Okay. Let me mention a couple of themes, and then a short reading from the book. I did a good deal of writing after the civil rights movement and doing community organizing in the 1960s. I did a lot of writing about citizen effort in the 1970s and 1980s. The time when the popular storyline in the mass media was that we had gone into a me decade, a me culture, where everybody was concerned with themselves. And what I found was a remarkable flowering of civic effort that was largely invisible. Christian Science Monitor called community effort the invisible and most important story of the 1970s. I also found that most mainstream politicians and political parties ignored that history. And so my work, in part, was trying to make visible the stories and examples of civic effort, and then trying to think about what are the lessons for the larger American tasks that we face. And in 1987, we started a work at the Humphrey Institute in Project Public Life with a group of partners, several of whom are here, to create examples of practical civic work where people in very different environments, in nursing homes and schools, in an African-American church in St. Louis, with cooperative extension across Minnesota, with youth projects, with low-income parents, with government agencies, people could experiment with the question, how can people who feel powerless and outside come back in with power and authority and dignity and a sense of right? And the central concept that we came to was that people feel they can have power and develop a confidence in their ability to act when they also feel they help to make things, when they help to create the world. It's not simply asking for things. It's not simply petitioning because people feel aggrieved or unfairly treated or victimized. It's when people feel also that they help create things, that they can kind of come in with a dignity and a power. And this tradition of creating the public world used to be called the Commonwealth tradition in America, and it used to be, in our judgment, as we argue in this book, the heart of American democracy. Not only public goods in the sense of libraries and parks and monuments, but also more broadly, the whole wealth of the nation was seen as having a public aspect. It was created by people. An example was the shipbuilders and artisans in Philadelphia in 1779 during the Revolutionary period, who argued that it was the wealth we have commonly created which gave people a right to participate in democracy and in governance of common affairs, and to challenge the powerful when they felt the powerful were violating principles of the Commonwealth. In the midst of an economic crisis in 1779 in Philadelphia, artisans challenged a wealthy merchant named Robert Morris for shipping grain outside the city. In view of the local scarcity of bread, they argued that Morris's property rights to use his ship were held in check by the social origins of property and the needs of the community. Quote, "We hold that the shipyard workers and the state, the government in general, the people, have a right in the service of the vessel," they argued, "because it constitutes a considerable part of the advantage that working people hope to derive from their labors." In other words, people who were building the ships didn't see themselves only working for private gain, but also they were building something of public use. Property, they argued, is subject to the Commonwealth. The property of the vessel is the immediate right of the owners, but the service of it is the right of the community collectively with the owners. Now, the interesting thing is that that point continued to fire people's sense of power and right through the 1930s and 40s in America. In fact, it was this perspective that Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican president, in 1908 articulated as the foundation for the right of the people to regulate corporate behavior, the robber barons of his age. Roosevelt argued this: "The true friend of property, the true conservative, is he who insists that property shall be the servant and not the master of the Commonwealth. The citizens of the United States must effectively control the mighty commercial forces which they themselves called into being." Which they themselves called into being. It was the fact that people had created the wealth of the nation that gave people some stake and right in controlling the wealth of the nation when it was out of bounds. In our work in this book, we interviewed a number of veterans of different movements and projects in the 1930s and 40s, and we found consistently that the specific term, Commonwealth, had powerful resonance. Nellie Stone Johnson, whom some of you probably know, an African-American trade union activist who's now in her 90s, a wonderful figure for many generations of people in the Twin Cities, told me some time ago that the problem in her judgment with the radicals of the 60s is that they had forgotten the meaning of Commonwealth. They didn't know what Commonwealth used to mean to common people. And when we interviewed people in the Civilian Conservation Corps in the who were active in the 1930s and 40s, now these were kids then, and they're in their 80s now. But we found it again and again, people's sense of their world, their experience, was transformed by the sense they were building a national treasure, creating a park or a forest. We talked to people like Francis Crowdis, who was an African-American man in an all-black civilian conservation camp in Indiana, who said that we all developed inquisitive minds and a remarkable sense of public life in this camp as we built a park in southern Indiana. They took on segregation in the local town, and they also felt they were making something of public use. And Mr. Crowdis went on to be a janitor at a college in Indianapolis, Marion College, for 50 years, and had such impact on students that when he retired not long ago, the college gave him an honorary degree and a doctorate of philosophy, and they gave him a office space and continued to pay his salary so people could come and talk to him about his life experience and life wisdom and the meaning of work and what it meant to be a person who was dedicated to building the Commonwealth.
Francis Crowdis was one of the most interesting people for me to interview. And he talked about not only the pride that he and his colleagues took and have taken through their life and what it is that they built, but he also said there was an intellectual life, and he said we were poor black kids. We didn't even have a pair of boots without holes in them. But he said we had our standards, and he told us that they discussed important topics like history and politics, and he said if you didn't know how to read when you came into this particular CCC camp, then you had to learn, because they had to read the paper. That was part of their life. So we also found out, and we believe strongly, that this idea that ordinary people can talk about important things is critical to a lively democracy. And even in the work that I do at the College of St. Catherine, it's amazing how at first shy people are about talking about these ideas, professors even, talking about democracy. But that as we begin to talk about our work in much more public terms, the environment is enlivened and all kinds of surprising things and surprising conversations happen. Harry spoke a little bit now about the Commonwealth, and I wanted to tell, as a last part before we have a discussion, a more recent story about the Commonwealth. And this is a story about Lake Union, and it's one that's in our book. Lake Union is a place in Seattle, Washington, and it's been the site of a great organizing effort headed by a man who's now died, but his name was Terry Pettus. And Terry Pettus was a longtime newspaper man and very involved in popular movements in the 20s through the 1940s. And he moved to Lake Union in Seattle in 1933 with his wife Berta. And he moved to a region on the lake where a lot of houseboat people lived, and it was kind of a motley, assorted, eclectic group of folks, from retired radicals to students to boatyard workers to bohemian types. And many poor people lived there because that was a place where rent was very cheap. And they lived in that area for many years. And in the 60s, when developers eyed that particular land for development, they tried to evict the houseboaters. Now, no one in Seattle thought that the houseboaters could be organized because they were such an odd group of rugged individualist types. But Terry Pettus is really an example of public leadership, and he understood that defining the issue in broad Commonwealth terms was the key to success. And so he, along with others, talked about Lake Union as a working lake. He tied the idea of he thought about the history of the lake. He talked about how barges in the 1800s had carried lumber and coal, and he talked about, you know, as the commercial development expanded, then boat docks needed to be created. So the lake was a place where people worked, and they fished, and it was used for recreation. In 1960, the city decided, however, that they would move the houseboaters out. And they said that they were a health hazard, and they pointed to the pollution in the lake. Now, the houseboaters knew after they had done some investigation that they did pollute, but it was a very small amount, and that in fact the city of Seattle was contributing a lot more pollution than they were. But they also knew that if they came up against City Hall claiming they polluted less than the city of Seattle, they wouldn't win. So it was this larger vision, this Commonwealth vision, that really motivated them and brought them together. They created the Floating Homes Association, and they did all kinds of interesting things. They worked with, not against, the Public Health Department. They learned how to weld pipes so that they could hook up sewer lines. They helped to build a public park. They held all kinds of public forums about the history of the lake and the importance of that legacy to the people who lived in the Seattle area. They tied their own fate to the future of the city. And in doing so, they really transformed the whole question that the people in the city were addressing. In the end, the city initiated a study which decided that the lake needed to be protected. And from that, they used that statement to develop a large park, and they also created one of the strongest lakeshore management control acts in the country. Now, this is a story that really shows how people doing public work around a particular issue can really begin to generate all kinds of ripple effect. And that in the end, it generated all kinds of other citizen-based activities. Seattle is known as one of the most active, citizen activist areas in the country, particularly in the 1970s. There are many lessons from this. To me, this was a great story, a story of transformation. And the lessons that we took from it were in part the leader was really a catalytic leader. And he understood the broader context so that the problem was defined broadly. And it was broad enough that individual interests could be embedded. He didn't polarize the issue. It also showed that public work is a vehicle for learning all kinds of political skills. The houseboaters learned all kinds of things. They learned how to craft a public argument. They learned how to talk to people, do house-to-house, one-on-one interviews. They learned how to talk to people in City Hall. Public work builds communities, and that's why we think that it's really a key to revitalizing democracy. It's different than calling for community building. It's a little bit different than calling for responsibility, as we hear some of the political leaders today do. It's a different angle. It takes a long time. It takes hard work. But in the process, we learn a lot, and we develop authentic power to make change. So in our book, there are lots of stories about how that's come about. Well, we hope that we might open this discussion up for a discussion about and ask you how these issues sort of fall with the current politics of the day, or what thoughts you might have about this.
This, in our judgment and in the book's argument, we think that politics has lost the politics of public work. That we're in a kind of, frankly, sick relationship between politicians and citizens, where politicians get tremendously detailed instant information about people's immediate needs, feed it back to people in campaign promises, and neither side believes the other. There's a tremendous corruption in the political chemistry today. And the response on the side of the general citizenry that those bums in politics just can't be trusted is much too simple. It's our perspective as pogos. We've met the enemy and they are us. That Americans have become consumers and spectators largely of public affairs and politics. And the challenge is for us to reclaim ownership in a sense of Abraham Lincoln, that government is our instrument and our reflection, and we get the kind of government we deserve. And the only way we can regenerate democracy and address our common tasks is to have citizens inside and outside of government remember traditions of working together on common problems. And I wanted to give one final story we tell in the book that's an example of a political leadership of the sort we think is really important. This is the mayor of Burnsville, Elizabeth Kautz. We interviewed her a year ago, and the culmination of this particular story just happened this summer, so we didn't put the final piece of it in. But Elizabeth Kautz in Burnsville was elected mayor a couple of years ago on this platform: government doesn't have to be bad. Now, it may seem a revolutionary idea, but imagine what her opponents tried to say in response. Elizabeth Kautz meant by that the government is as good as the people, and that she would work with people, but she wasn't going to overpromise. And her platform was government needed to be a catalyst, to provide people tools, be a space, convene people for action, but it couldn't solve the problems of Burnsville, a suburb in South Minneapolis area. And she's done many things to try to make that real. And she says it's hard, because people will come to her and say, we want you to fix this, and she'll say, I can't do it. I can't fix it. And people will be mad at her. She said, I ran on this platform, you remember. I can't fix everything. But a striking example was with a group of skateboarders, teenage skaters in Burnsville, who a year ago were getting busted all the time by the police. And she went and met with them, and she said, well, what's going on? They said, well, we don't have any place to skate. We only can skate down the schools in the middle of the main street, because we don't have any place to skate. And they said, so, but we might be responsible if you got us a skateboard park. Elizabeth Kautz said, I'm not going to get you anything, but I would work with you to help open up things if you wanted to organize an effort to get a park. And over the last year, those kids, this kind of scruffy skateboarder group that reminds me of the houseboaters in Lake Union, have gone to work. They've learned political skills, they've met with neighbors, they've developed relations with businesses, they've developed a relationship with an architect. And a month or so ago, we went to the city council meeting where the whole city council, which originally had been horrified at the idea of a skateboard park in Burnsville, unanimously voted to support the kids in a plan working with the recreation department, with the funds in place, the insurance in place, the plans in place, support from neighbors in place, to create a skateboard park in Burnsville. This was an amazing scene. You know, it was a city auditorium in Burnsville full of skateboarders. And then a few parents kind of looking like, what in the world is happening here? But our judgment is that those kids will be forever different, because they'll have a different sense of their stake and their role and their possibility in the community, wherever they live, but certainly in Burnsville. But also our sense is that this is not the norm in political discourse these days. So we'd like to open it up, see what you think, have some argument, have some questions, whatever.
Yes?
Why do you think the myth of the rugged individualist American has endured for so long, when it's fairly clear that it's been through community and public works and public politics that things get done in this country?
Well, I think America's always had kind of two souls. There's always been a combination.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, why has the myth of individualism, or the rugged individual imagery, persisted so powerfully when it's clear that we've only gotten things done through working together? So, kind of the gist of it. You know, in a lot of ways, America is a land of people who escaped countries where they felt oppressed by community, or by the way things were done, or by traditions, or by the iron weight of the past, or by orthodoxy that they couldn't break out of. So it has, and I think, in my judgment, American individualism has some real things to recommend it. There's a kind of experimentalism, an openness, a quirkiness, an iconoclasm. It's one of the things that makes me personally uneasy about the call for simply community. I think in America, community has always been balanced at its best by a spirit of individualism and questioning and dissent and cantankerous individuals who say, I just disagree with that, or the blacksmith who was an atheist, or the beatnik who didn't believe in family values. But I think there's always been a balance between cooperative work together on common projects and individualism. And the danger, the tremendous danger over the last generation is that as we've become increasingly a nation of consumers, and we've lost a public world, an appreciation of public things. I'm afraid we saw this dramatically in the Republican Party convention, and I think we're going to see it in the Democratic convention next week. I think we've gotten really out of balance. That's the great danger, it seems to me.
There's a wonderful book written by Gordon Wood. It's called The Radicalization of the American Revolution. We use that in our work. And he talks a lot about the dramatic change that happened after the Revolutionary War, and that people saw themselves as owners of their work, that they could actually make decisions on their own, that they had standing and authority because of the skills that they possessed. It wasn't just property that they owned, but also what they could do in the world. And I bet that that has something to do, and that was unique, that tie of democracy to work. That was unique, that has been unique in America. And I bet that also has something to do with this notion of individualism and its importance, really, in democracy. There's another author, his name is Wiebe, and he wrote a book called Self-Rule. He uses the term portable democracy, the idea that people themselves are Democrats, small d Democrats, and that wherever they go and whatever they do, they can together rule themselves. And but that idea of individualism is also key there. So it seems like it's a mix of working together, but also the idea that people have standing and authority on the basis of what it is they contribute.
Christine.
Today, President Clinton signed the bill having to do with a lot of changes in welfare, and there's been a lot of fear on the parts of many people about children on the streets and families not being served in a way that they've been served before, and where's the money going to come from to take care of these programs. Considering what you've been talking about the transformation, the transforming power of people working together to build public things, do you see this as this change in the welfare system, and we don't know what that's going to be, as an opportunity or as a scary thing? I mean, does it work into this whole concept at all to you?
I think it does, and it's probably both an opportunity and a scary thing. But the danger is that today we don't value making public things. The CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps example that Harry talked about, came at a time when in our country we valued public goods, public work. We paid attention to them. We took care of them. Right now, the trend is really toward privatization. And I think that it is that notion, recalling the importance of a commonwealth, of what we hold in common, what we value publicly, not just private wealth, will be a key toward making this transformation in welfare work. That if you put people to work and make work jobs, that's not going to do it.
The striking thing is to contrast the language around welfare debate today with the 1930s. And today the whole tone of the welfare debate has this kind of punitive, negative, blaming quality. Get these bums off welfare. They're corrupting the society by their example. Whereas in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt established the Civilian Conservation Corps, the way he framed it was, we have a vast number of people in America whose talents are going to waste. And we need to create work around public purposes, simple work, that creates the country and answers significant public needs. And I think that the shift in the vocabulary of the welfare and poverty debate is really instructive about what we've lost and what we have to rebuild. You and then Tom.
Okay. Is the idea of public work being taught or encouraged in schools around the country?
The question is the idea of public work being taught and encouraged? Well, it certainly is beginning. You see signs. And whether it's called that explicitly or not, we tell in the book, Building America, a number of examples of educational experiences which are successful in our judgment because they're about public work and an understanding of education as public work. For example, a remarkable complex of schools in East Harlem called Central Park East Schools, mostly minority and poor kids from the East Harlem area, where 98% of the kids graduate and 80% go on to college. Now, the Central Park East Schools, the director of them, Deborah Meyer, says that public work is a very good way to describe what they do in their philosophy. And they have created a culture of public work in education in a number of ways. Teaching itself and learning is described as a public question that everybody can participate in discussing, teachers and parents and students and staff, support staff, community people. Students are described as workers, and education is described as work. And the question around education is always to students, what are you doing of importance? What are you creating? So, and there's a lot of effort to think about what students can create. There's a lot of self-direction that students have in their learning, but it's informed by the challenge to students to take your learning seriously and take it as a creative activity. And there's a lot of community involvement. There's a sense that everyone is a co-producer of the learning process. And then the final thing in the Central Park East School Complex is that it has a large mission. It's seen as education for democracy, education for democratic citizenship. And that creates a kind of confidence in the law that's remarkable to see in students.
A second example of that is at the College of St. Catherine. You know, environments have particular cultures, and academic cultures, most of you know, have particular characteristics of not working too well together, people sort of being holed up in their disciplines. But we have really taken this question on very seriously. And we are asking ourselves as a group of faculty, and I think in the broader college, if our work were public as teachers, what would it look like? How would we be different? Now, we don't exactly have answers to those questions yet, but simply asking the question and beginning conversation all over the place with students. We hold public forums with students, talking to them about their part in learning. What is it we're creating together? These kinds of questions begin the process of transforming institutions and organizations toward working differently. We're going to have, every year we have an opening workshop, and this year, and generally it's, you know, the officials of the institution present to the body that works there, faculty and staff, sort of the state of the college. But this year we've decided we videotaped a whole array of workers, from the gardener to receptionists to students to faculty and some administrators, asking, what is the purpose of your work? How does your work relate to learning? And we've not done it yet, but I've seen the videotape, and it is incredible to see the ways in which people think differently about their work. And the gardener, for example, said, my job is about creating beauty. And he talked about how it is he contributes to learning through his work. And each one of those people we interviewed did that. So you can begin to get a feel when you ask the question, change starts to happen. And as we think about not just the process of how we work together, but what is it we're creating together, we are beginning to have a very vibrant, lively college that's different than it was 10 years ago.
comment and a question about the question about welfare and its relationship to work. I'm struck by how when one of the issues has been whether or not people, once their 2 years are up, whether or not there's going to be a job there. And usually when they talk about it, even liberals talk about it in terms of, well, if you can't get a private job, we'll give you a public job as a job of last resort, which to me is backwards.
Shows the problem. Yeah.
And so one thing I think we can all do is try to change that language and engage in discussion with people like my dad. The other thing is I had a question about professions, and if you deal with or have any ideas about, you mentioned teaching, I'm also a college teacher, and the role of the disciplines. And it seems to me that whether it's romantic or real, there wasn't one time at least, I would like to think, a reality of profession. And also I think crafts, I'm not just talking about white collar professions.
That's right.
As having a public dimension. And it seems to me the professionalization of professions has gotten us away from that. And when you deal with how you would talk about it.
There were 2 points. One was the kind of narrow negative language about the welfare debate. Tom O'Connell was making the point that when we talk about welfare recipients getting jobs, we think about public sector jobs as a last resort. And what a shift and a degradation of the notion of creation of public goods, that is. It really reflects the degradation of the public world in our judgment. The second question was about professionalism and the narrowing of professionalism and the public identities, public aspects of professionalism. In our judgment, this is a very powerful problem that has a lot of implications. In fact, it has a lot to do with the fact that people feel so powerless these days. Because many institutions, we argue in the book, where there used to be a kind of a civic muscle, where people used to develop some sense of power, not only in their own neighborhood, but in the larger world, in issues of policy and politics, like neighborhood schools or settlement houses or local unions. When I came to Minnesota about 20 years ago, I was really struck that even several decades ago, people talked about unions as having storefront offices. These kinds of places which used to connect people and give people a sense of voice. People used to come in and be able to work together on projects. And the settlement house, for example, they'd work on water problems or immigration problems. And in many cases, those institutions have become providers of services. I always have students at the Humphrey Institute give stories like this, and I had a really poignant story last year of a student who described, this is a woman in her mid-20s, even when she was growing up, the community centers on the range were public spaces where people work together. Now they're places where people come to get job counseling and other kinds of services. Now that reflects a tremendous change in the notion of professionalism. We've lost largely the older whole house understanding of a social worker who lives in the community and works with people, or the teacher who's seen as a civic leader of a community, or the medical practitioner who's a part of the community life. And we have much more a notion of professional who comes in and fixes people. A lot of our work and a lot of the examples we use in this book, Building America, are about how we can rebuild a sense of much more public, professional, and craft practice.
Comment about that.
One last one.
I was just going to say, like, community service is given as a punishment. For example, you have I don't know the exact misdemeanors, but you can receive community service as a punishment instead of, by the government.
That language is really dramatic. Her point was that community service is lifted up as punishment for something that you've done. You pay back the community through doing it. But I do think that points to the problem of language and our attitude toward public goods. It's I think we have to conclude, although we could still have the conversations informally, but Harry and I thank you very much for coming, and thank Hungry Mind for inviting us to come, and Mary Vogel for introducing us.
Thanks again for coming. Copies of Harry and Nancy's book, Building America, are up front by the registers. They'll be back here to field questions one-on-one, two-on-one. and sign books. Thanks again.